Hi everyone, I'm Leila. I'm a freelance writer and I work with It's Freezing in LA and other magazines to write mainly about culture and housing. I'm really excited to be here for what promises to be a really enlivening discussion on the future of our cities, our public housing, and our lived environment. I'm so excited to be here with It's Freezing in LA and Housmans. So if you don't already know, It's Freezing in LA is an independent magazine which was established in 2018 and which publishes features and essays on all things climate. So from our ongoing border crises and climate reparations to environmental activism and music and culture that relates to the Anthropocene. And of course, the issue that brings us all here today is housing. So in the UK today, there are currently 350,000 homes that stand empty. And yet the cycle of construction and demolition is endless. These industries contribute 35% of Britain's waste, and it's disproportionately council estates that are left to disintegrate, which then justifies their demolition, not only releasing CO2 into the air that we breathe, toxifying our communities, but causing a huge level of displacement and homelessness for former residents. So climate justice is housing justice because both are demands for people to have a safe place to inhabit and for community longevity. Today, you'll be hearing from speakers on how we can literally build a future that's safe for everyone and why it's imperative that that future incorporates accessible and maintained green public housing for all. So I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers first, and then they'll spend a couple of minutes introducing their work and their research and their projects. So we'll start with Matt and Fiona, and then we'll have Adam and then Josh after that. After that, we'll have a broader Q&A in which I'll ask a few questions, and I also really do encourage everyone to put their questions in the Q&A box as well. As you can see, we do have a lot of speakers today, which I think speaks to the fact that within a conversation about social housing and also the environment, the two aren't often put together. And we speak a lot about like sustainable development, sustainable private building practices, but very infrequently about how we can make public housing sustainable and talking about social housing as well. So I want to talk specifically about house building social housing as opposed to house building and construction and architecture more broadly. So Matthew Springer and Fiona McDonald are award-winning architects. Matthew runs a collaborative design studio at the Bartlett School of Architecture and also works with the firm MSA on a variety of projects in the US and the UK. Fiona is head of learning at the Design Museum and bridges design and collaboration in her practice, working with young people and community members in her projects. Matt and Fiona's shared practice, Matt and Fiona, is a social enterprise which involves young people in the shaping of their built environment. So they center young people and children in the shaping of buildings in which we work, live, and play, and use self-design and self-build projects to reimagine who has agency in the places that we spend our lives. Adam Almeida is a research analyst with the Centre for Labour and Social Studies and works with the Runnymede Trust to research gentrification in London. He's also researched health-related data from programs in the Global South and the impact of EU enforced austerity on public health in Portugal. Josh Benton is an architecture writer and an essayist based in Birmingham. He's written extensively on architecture and the built environment, including for It's Freezing in LA. His work focuses on the need for architects to adapt to the changing future of cities. He is a co-founder of After Party Zine, of which I am a huge fan, which is a publication in a digital space dedicated to exploring cities through the lens of identity and race. So now I'll have the speakers introduce themselves. So if we could start with Matt and Fiona.
Hi, thanks, Leila, and thanks everyone for inviting us tonight. Thanks for joining us. I'm Matt Springer, and Leila, you've done a wonderful job at introducing us. I guess really adding to that is that hopefully Fiona and I are here tonight in our kind of capacity as educators, I think, as much as our capacity of both being trained as architects. the venture that we started off, or the adventure that we started off on 5 years ago, was preceded by probably 8 or 10 years before that, working collaboratively with young people, and always, as you said, exploring and giving them agency in the projects. But 5 years ago, we collectively and separately had a series of experiences which made us believe that we could take the processes and projects that we had been doing collectively with young people in terms of consulting them about the spaces that they lived in and worked in further. And we've developed a sort of a process and a system where we involve and work with communities of young people anywhere between the age of sort of 5 and 18, and enable them through a unique process which brings them in right at the start of a process if there's change in their environment through the brief building. We help them through a series of sort of processes to develop designs, physically build them, so they make interventions in their workspace and their play spaces, and then allow them to take ownership of that. And that's a model that's evolved and evolving increasingly now to becoming bigger and more adventurous, where we're really having an opportunity to shape those spaces, particularly in the realm of kind of where people live.
Thanks, Matt. So we're particularly interested in the fact that, and I think this is where Matt and Fiona came from, that in the UK currently, the built environment is something that impacts on us hugely, but it's not currently taught in schools, and teachers are not given the agency and the knowledge and the skills to enable the next generation that they're bringing up to really have the confidence and those skills to engage in conversations around their built environment and the future of their housing. And if you think about the longevity of how long it takes to create homes, create housing, whether that's new housing or retrofit, the number of years means that actually someone who's 5 years old today will actually be the person who will be living in the housing that we're building now. And when you start thinking in that kind of terms, it really hits home where that empowerment needs to happen. So some examples of projects. We don't just work on housing projects. A really important project for us and testing this idea of is it possible to enable young people to set the brief, design and build, was working with a group of young people in Hull who had been excluded from mainstream school, and working with them over a series of months to enable them to have a space of their own within a very institutional school setting. So they'd been given use of an allotment, but they had no way to use that in poor weather. So we enabled them. The original brief set by adults was to help them to create a shed. They were having none of that. They wanted a den. They wanted a place that was theirs. Most of these young people had never had any space that they could consider their own. And over a series of months, they designed that, they built it in a week. They did push boundaries. The rules on the allotment were that you could build a green or brown shed. It was green, ultimately, what they made, but it was much more than that. And it's somewhere that really became symbolic of home for many of those young people and went on to win People's Choice Award in AJ Small Projects. So shows that young people's ideas and their lived in experience is absolutely vital to creating quality design. More recently, one of the newest projects that we're working on and supporting is an incredible woman called Rebecca Carr, who's working in York and is part of an organisation called YOCO, which is looking at how communities can develop housing in homes in a very grassroots way. And again, she recognises the importance of involving young people absolutely at the outset of that. So through workshops that in a very interactive way think about what the brief should be, and thinking also in terms of homes, that your home isn't just the four walls in which you sleep or the four walls in which you eat. It's that wider community. It's what are the opportunities that housing or that those homes provide for meeting your friends, for feeling safe, for accessing high quality outdoor space. So increasingly our projects are increasing in length, that we work often with communities over many years now to enable them to really get that brief part right. And then it's about the skills building of how do you design, but also how do you build, and how do you have that that agency to be able to directly shape your own built environment. And shelter is something so fundamental and so human. It's really quite strange how much that's been distilled in such a serviced kind of world that we live in here in the UK. So that's what Matt and Fiona does. We never set out with the intention to set up an organisation, and each project that we embark on is definitely, as Matt says, an adventure. But we think that that's so important, and we have huge faith in the next generation.
Thank you so much. That sounds fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to drawing on your experience, as your practical experience as architects, to also inform our discussion on how we can physically create the spaces that we need for people, as you've been saying. If I can now move on to Adam, can you tell us something about you and your work?
Sure. So my name is Adam, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate this evening. I've spent many an evening browsing the books at Housmans, so thank you so much for having me, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. My research experience, or in previous roles, I've worked as a data analyst and quantitative researcher. So last year I set out within Runnymede Trust and the Center for Labor and Social Studies to empirically measure gentrification levels across London in the past decade. So I developed a novel methodology in order to quantify the process of gentrification, and to measure things like change in race and ethnicity at a neighborhood level, the number of people who move out of a neighborhood within a given time frame, changing levels of deprivation and house prices. So I have studied anti-gentrification movements in London, specifically in South London around Elephant and Castle. I'm very interested in the topic and the kind of question, what are our cities for? And what kind of city do we want to live in? So I'm very excited to speak tonight.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to hopefully maybe getting into the evils of Southwark Council in particular with you. Josh, I'd love to hear from you. So Josh is an architect writer. Tell us about your work.
Thanks so much again for the opportunity to be here, both to It's Freezing NLA and Housmans. I think you've already pretty much covered quite a bit of my background, Leila, but I'll just give something that people might not know from our bios. I actually spent I spent 14 years of my life living in council housing. It was a social housing block in Birmingham, and I'm now actually based in London, to be honest. But that's obviously shown me firsthand the general approach, and seeing how it's shifted over time in terms of maintenance and new building work. Following that, I've graduated from the London School of Architecture, where my thesis project was about how we can use vacant high street spaces to really impact the quality of life, health, and well-being of disadvantaged communities. And the reason why I bring that up is because I think it speaks to some of the things that Matt and Fiona were sharing in terms of empowering the local community, but also in the way that when money is well spent and well allocated, it really can make a difference in people's lives. Since then, I've gone on to write and work in practice as well, although I'm not currently. And having written about things like how communities can be left behind in places like Stratford, following on from the Olympic legacy movement, but also increasing about how we can push for greater sustainability generally, and the ways in which the government could definitely be doing more to encourage and or legislate to push architects, builders, contractors to really do more in the face of the climate crisis. So that's me.
Thank you so much. And I think it's really important also, speaking about your lived experience of living in social housing, to point out that, as chair, I've never lived in social housing. And I think it's important that I acknowledge that I come from that positionality and that place of privilege. I have some questions of my own for the speakers, but as I was saying earlier, if you have any questions that arise having heard everyone's initial introductions, please do add your questions as we go along. I want this to be as democratic and broad a conversation as possible. But I guess my first question, having heard Matt and Fiona, you talking about how your practice has developed over the last 5 years, and also Josh talking about the Olympic legacy, it's just about the last, since 2010, kind of legacy of austerity and how that's impacted our green imagination. So how has it impacted, in your opinion, our ability to even conceptualize being able to provide green, well-maintained and safe housing for everyone? And do you think that is something that you feel that you're able to articulate and provide for? And do you feel like it's something that we are able to imagine now, or has our imagination been so conditioned by austerity that that seems far off or impossible? How do you think austerity has impacted not only the availability of housing, but our sort of idea of the future and how we're going to be able to achieve, I guess, the promise of the Green New Deal? If I can start with Josh. Oh, Josh, you're on mute.
Yeah, I think that in terms of how austerity has affected our ability to, specifically the Green New Deal aspect of it, I think councils have had such a reduction in funding. I mean, as you say, so I think it's something like £8.9 billion across from the 80s to 2017. And so that's affected their ability to research new ways of doing. So it's not just about building new housing. A lot of the time they're falling back on the same old practices and same old approaches. And what that means is we just have the same old results. So it's not only about the research, the building, but it affects their ability to maintain. So increasingly they're pulling back as they're just unable to really contribute in a meaningful way to whether it's window upgrades or even the basic things like roofs and the external fabric. So that's really a key issue. And then following that, there's less and less room for the general public to get involved and share how their experiences are really happening in reality. So I think the aspect of less money being fueled towards social housing, it's not, I think if we could broaden it out beyond just building, it really affects it at every level. So that's how I would see it in a summary form.
Thank you so much. And Matt and Fiona, has austerity impacted the way that you work? You were saying that you've changed your practice over the last 5 years, and how do you imagine our future? How do you imagine the shaping of your practice under the current political conditions?
Well, I think, it's worth saying austerity hasn't just hit housing, it's hit everything, particularly education. And it means that inequality in schools has increased, which again ties into gentrification. So schools are increasingly relying on the additional opportunities and support they can get in kind from their parent and guardian body. And those people who have greater cultural capital have the freedom to have more time to volunteer because of the types of jobs they do, then has a knock-on impact on the skills and the learning that the young people in those schools are developing. So it's of huge concern to us. I think there's also worth saying that in times of austerity, unfortunately, governments can then push, well, that's when creativity happens. But along with that creativity comes even greater inequality. What we're looking at the moment is we've been analysing the kind of the impact that we've had over the last 5 years, and the type of build projects we do are incredibly in-depth, enabling a group of young people to brief, design and build essentially their own building. But how do we enable the positive impact of that to spread much further than just that group of students? And that's where austerity really kicks in, that all of the schools, the community groups we work with, they don't cover the cost of the projects. That always has to be externally funded. And that funding, I don't think that funding has ever come from local authority or government. It's always come from private sponsorship or trusts and foundations, which again fuels that disparity of opportunity, that it's not equal for every young person. And so it's sort of moving back up the food chain and needing to address that.
I think even very directly, the sort of lived experience of many of the young people we're working with, we'll often start a project, and that could be in any city within the UK, with an opportunity for the young people that we're working with to visit other parts of their built environment, maybe within their city, maybe even within their own borough. And it's almost without exception that there will be, large portions of the groups of people we're working with who haven't probably visited the rest of their city beyond their postcode. And that ability to have a lived experience beyond your immediate surroundings is critical to having a kind of a wider outlook on the world. Particularly in a city as our major capital cities or large cities within the UK, for young people not to have that opportunity through their education, which they previously probably would have had with many more visits, many more opportunities to see new things. And then I guess on a wider level, we can talk about this later, but Fee spent some time doing some research in the last 5 years in visiting Finland, and we're fascinated by that model of kind of architecture being on the national curriculum there. So much has been stripped in terms of kind of the creative and arts and design within the curriculum, both at primary and secondary school, that the sort of frames and references, the if you like, the hooks that might draw young people into thinking about their built environment more and the homes in which they live, is dwindling, and that's a real challenge.
Yeah, and I wonder, Adam, if you can continue what Matt's already done in broadening this conversation beyond the UK, to again think about how austerity has impacted the way that we can imagine the future, particularly the future of housing and of public health, which I know that you've researched. How do you think austerity has made an impact on the way that we live and the way that we will continue to live from your work?
Well, as a Portuguese national, I've seen the way that austerity policy has transformed the country, and can see how in the past 10 years, Portugal is now a different country. I think what's interesting, and I might be wrong, but I believe the UK is the only country that was in the European Union that self-imposed austerity rather than had Troika or the IMF or whatever impose it upon them. So I think austerity impacts our imagination because it creates the falsehood that we're living in poor conditions, and in reality we're actually living in a time of great wealth and wealth generation, but it lowers the standard of living so vastly that you really are arguing for scraps, right? And and we're seeing that even with universal credit with £20, which is nothing compared to the amount of wealth that's held by the elite in this country. And so I think it just lowers the standard in which we argue for decent homes, like that should be a given in a modern society. So I think that austerity and the post-2008 world has really seen the role of states transform and change, and that states have really pulled back and have allowed finance and the private sector to fill that gap. And what we're seeing is that there's a diminishing quality of homes. It's not keeping up with the amount of demand. The supply is not keeping up, and that we're not well equipped to deal with a radically changing environment, a climate that's radically changing. So I think it's impacted, but maybe as Fiona was saying, it also has driven, there's a drive towards more radical solutions as our environment changes more radically. So I welcome some radical solutions.
Thank you so much. And I guess on that note, so you're talking about our kind of pre-existing social housing stock that we already have. I wonder if I can hear from everyone about what threats you think that climate change poses to the social housing that we do already have, and to working class communities in particular. And how can we as activists, architects, and researchers address those threats? If I could start with Matt and Fiona.
That's a big question.
Yeah.
Matt, do you want to go?
Let me jump in and I'll frame my thoughts.
Okay. Well, I think, and this is talking from the perspective, as I think we said at the start, that we focus most on education, but of course there are it flows through to housing and homes. I think we're already seeing it in what's happening even in London with flooding, that essentially there are people in the world who have more agency and people in the world who have less agency. And generally it's going to be those people who have both less financial capital and less, arguably, cultural capital to know, to be savvy to what could be going on, that will lose out most. And that's the biggest risk. And I think as Matt was talking to point earlier about knowing what you can demand and what you can ask for and what is possible, and having that knowledge at your fingertips to use in the face of in essentially talking truth to power. Well, to be able to talk truth to power, you need that kind of that knowledge. So I mean, we're concerned in terms of what we're seeing within education. A lot of teachers are saying that they don't feel that they have the knowledge and the skills to be imparting the information that they want. In fact, it came up recently. We were in conversation with Victoria Thornton, who has been a big mentor to us. She set up Open House London many years ago, and she was asking, can you recommend resources around sustainability for young people? And there are relatively few resources that are being directed towards young people. So making sure that there's that level of information that's reaching everyone to inform themselves is part and parcel of that issue. In terms of how to address that, I think maybe it's a two-pronged attack, whether that's we try and sometimes use guerrilla tactics, but I think that's in the nature of what we do, of being within an organization and changing it rather than from the outside. That there's definitely huge value in both ways.
Yeah, and I think again from our point of view, I mean, the many of the kind of, I think, talking to the areas of our strengths, we're not architects of social housing. So, but in terms of, I think this idea that that if you don't understand what your rights are, then it becomes very hard to create the sort of groundswell that activism you're talking about within a community, within a block of flats, within a housing association. It becomes very difficult to have that. But actually, when you understand those rights, and that comes through education, then you have that opportunity. I think one of the challenges also we're finding is that it's often the grassroots organizations like ours that really find there's a deep yearning and need for what we're doing. We're approached by lots of schools. We've been approached by in a project, for example, in New York that we're talking about, which we will work with for a long period of time to raise the funds to be able to help them and reach for, if you like, create the activism from the bottom. But what we really struggle to do is to find any open door really at the sort of top level, whether that's in meaningfully in local authority, although we have had some interesting kind of conversations with Camden recently about understanding the importance of our processes. And I think the GLA have been quite open to that as well. But outside of London, I couldn't talk to that specifically. But I do feel, I mean, one of the things he said in the first 5 years, and reflecting actually in COVID, when sadly a lot of our projects, the physical building of our projects had to pause, was a moment of reflection. And the part of that now is really realizing our role as activists, as much as it is to deliver us, or at least a part of what we do is about that activism. And yeah, what we're really trying to do now is get the sort of the openings in those doors higher up at government level, and that we're really struggling to do that, and that's no surprise because of the resistance.
Yeah, I think it was so interesting what you were saying, Fiona, about sort of feeling as if you have to use guerrilla tactics. I was speaking with Peter Barber, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, but who is an architect of primarily social housing in the UK, for those of you who might not know him or be familiar with his work. And he was saying that when you're trying to get planning permission to build social housing, you often feel as if you're being like a naughty boy because the government is so resistant, or councils are often very resistant to commissioning that housing and building affordable housing for people. But to return, sorry for digressing, to return to my question, which is the threat that climate change poses to our pre-existing social housing. Josh, I wonder if I can bring you in here. What threats, or what are the primary threats that you see climate change posing to social housing in particular, and to working class communities who occupy them?
Yeah, I think in terms of the way that that climate change is impacting those communities, there's three issues I see mainly. One, I begin with quality of life. If people get that perception that the homes that they're living in and the communities that they're living in aren't being valued by those people who are supposed to be maintaining them, that really impacts the sense of well-being. I don't think it's a massive leap from, my block isn't being well maintained, ergo I'm not a person of importance, or this community can't be, highly valued. So I think that aspect on how we see community and how we see each other, that well-being element isn't to be undervalued. Oftentimes, and it's something I've written about before, we get this perception that there's bad communities, or it's not the issue of the councils, it's that the people who are there are bad. But when we actually make a commitment to maintain the area, I think we'd be surprised about the way people's mindsets about themselves and about the collective would change. So I think I'd start with quality of life and mainly the well-being element. The second one is financial instability. I've worked with Tower Hamlets councils on a few of their recent social housing projects, and I think they're doing quite a lot for the borough's residents. They've built, I think, I know personally, 3 recent schemes which were 100% affordable housing. And the key driver of those designs were, how can we alleviate fuel poverty? So I think if people are continuing in homes that are drafty, that are, really inefficient, of course, it's going to put a greater pressure on their fuel bills. And so I think that's only going to worsen any financial instability they're already experiencing for whatever reason. And again, if we're trying to build communities and help everyone collectively progress at all scales, then I think we should be trying to help support, financial stability. And then the final one, sort of linking back into the first one, is health. Everyone's seen those pictures of black mold strewn walls and things like that. But even at the more basic level of drafty homes, that can really impact, especially young children, that can impact their health. And in general, poor maintenance we know it's factually does contribute to poor health outcomes. So those are the ways I see impacting the community. But all of those three come together and create that perception, as I say, where we're not valued, and maybe we should look for some other means to find value. And I think that's a deeper element which goes to a broader societal issue of class in general.
Absolutely. And Adam, I wonder if you have anything to add to that from your perspective, especially from maybe a public health perspective, or any other thoughts that you might have.
Yeah, well, I think the points that have been raised are really good. And we know that, working class communities and communities of color in Britain are going to bear the brunt of the climate crisis. But even if we look macroscopically at the social housing stock, it's vastly underprepared to address the reality of climate change. In 2020 alone, 30 million people were climate refugees. And as we know, as refugees leave the global south and enter the global north, they need to be housed somewhere. And our stock is diminishing year upon year upon year. And so you have a situation in which the West is disproportionately responsible for climate change. And yet the people in the global south need to return or need to come to the metropole where the largest emitters reside and hoard wealth. So I think the social housing stock doesn't address at all the impact that the United Kingdom has had in creating this disaster. And it's ill-prepared to deal with the people who will be most impacted by it. So, the issue of supply and demand, I think, is going to be even greater and greater as it is now. council alone has 20,000 people waiting for social housing. And that's under strict protocols of who's eligible and hostile environment policy and all of this kind of stuff. So yeah, I think the social housing sector needs to be, transformed if we have any chance of helping humanity.
Yeah, definitely. That was, yeah. Adam, you've actually accumulated 2 questions. So Martha says that she would, I guess actually I can open these to the room, but if we can start with Adam, she says she'd love to hear more about gentrification. If we can improve the quality of our buildings to preserve materials and to avoid demolition, will this be enough to stop people being made to leave their homes through developments? And how can we convince councils to spend more on keeping up the quality of building stock? And then Cersei says, on that, what has been council's response to the push to the margins report? So I recently spoke to a 35% campaign in Southwark, and they mentioned that Southwark Council would like more credit on their infilling schemes, i.e. building on parks, but do recognize some of their mistakes on estate demolition. So we could truly talk about Southwark Council all day, I feel. Yeah, let's start with gentrification. So will improving quality help to avoid demolition and help to avoid displacement? And then on that, if anyone knows more about the push to the margins report, if they could also talk about that, starting with Adam.
Yes, well, I mean, gentrification, and I think the kind of coalition building that's possible of getting people who are engaged in the fight against climate change, as well as those who are engaged in the fight against gentrification, actually have a lot in common. We know from grassroots groups like Just Space and Architects for Social Housing that not only the most environmentally friendly or sustainable approach is to infill and to build upon what's already there and to kind of use this never demolish approach to build upon the built environment in order to keep up with demand. But that is also the most socially responsible. It prevents the social cleansing and racial cleansing of people out of estates, which is responsible for mass displacement in London throughout the country. In London alone, that's what my research looked at, but throughout the entire country. So I think there's a lot of interesting models that are being developed. I think Architects for Social Housing, specifically in their work in, I believe it's West Kensington, they've developed a model in which they go into a council estate and invite residents to come and contribute and to highlight what works in the built environment and what doesn't work, where are places that need to be maintained, where are places that are dangerous for children to play in and all of this stuff. And what you have is people democratically involved and creating a sustainable solution that allows them to be invested in the betterment of their environment without fear of being displaced out. And I think that that's a lot of the issues, that people don't have faith in the local authority and the council and all of that, because the council is responsible for mass displacement and not building homes for the people who live there. So I think that the environmental aspect is, I'd love to see more collaboration between these two groups that I think are incorrectly distinct and actually share a lot in common, which is creating a better environment, whether socially or environmentally or whatever. On the second point, I've heard some whisperings about the report and the response from local councils. They've not been very pleased with me, but that's okay. I didn't write the report to impress them. So I've heard some stuff from Southwark Council and Tower Hamlets and all of that stuff. So I'm glad that the work is resonating with people who are engaged in anti-gentrification struggle and for fighting for a better city for working class people and people of color.
Great. I feel like the question about Southwark Council building or proposing to build on parks kind of leads into a question that I had, which is, do we really need to be constructing more homes, or is the level of construction that we saw in the post-war consensus, where up to 200,000 new homes are being built per year, is that desirable or achievable now when we have so many homes that are sitting empty, and yet we're continuing to demolish and construct new homes? Like, is that actually what we want, or is it possible for us to solve the housing crisis without having to build or construct on the same mass scale? So Matt and Fiona, and also Josh, our architects in the room, what do you think about, do we require the same level of construction as we had in the post-war consensus, which I feel often on the left is kind of looked at with a kind of sense of nostalgia or like rose-tinted specs. Is this level of construction sustainable now? Do we really need it? And do we need to be erasing green spaces for social housing, or is it possible to rectify our current situation? Let's start with Josh.
Thanks. I wanted to sort of just riff on something that Adam mentioned in terms of, the idea that there isn't enough, in terms of there isn't enough stock to cope with the growth of the population that we will see as people continue to migrate. And I was going to throw something in and say, is this when we're going to start speaking about right to buy purchases and the way that impacts the amount of homes that we have in terms of social housing? Now, I'm a bit on the fence on this one. I know that a lot of architects call for the wholesale cancellation of right to buy, but I think what we do need is some form of adjustment, because it perhaps in its current form, it just really isn't working. I wouldn't say that we need to scrap it altogether, because I do think we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and get rid of what can be for some people a means of progressing on the housing ladder. But I think it's interesting, though, this aspect of, how do we need to build more homes? I would say we do. I do think, though, alongside that, building of new homes, we need better controls. Again, just as we have, I would recommend better controls on right to buy. I think we need better controls on foreign purchases of new build homes. A lot of the time, we'll see a new building complex go up, and then you'll only see one or two lights on, in the evening, because the majority of purchases are from abroad, and it's strictly as an asset and an investment. So I think we do need to reframe the way we see and allow people to own homes in this country. And if that was the case, and if homes were being built and used to be lived in, that could really change the way that the market is working at the moment. I've also heard a lot of talk in architectural circles about increasing rent controls, and also controls for landlords in terms of the numbers of homes that people should be able to own, again, as rental investments. Again, on this one, I'm going to be probably the odd one out here. I don't think we should have wholesale limits on the number of properties people can purchase. What I would say is we do need to look at that, so that I think it's exorbitant for someone to need 60, 100 homes in London. It doesn't really make sense. So we should be looking at that. Perhaps I wouldn't suggest going to the extremes of what Berlin are doing, but if we are treating homes more akin to dwelling places, and as Fiona said earlier, a place of retreat and a place of safety, it really doesn't make sense the way that currently they're treated as assets. So I would say yes, build more, but look at the way we're handling right to buy and the sell-off of assets we already own, and look at the way that we're treating new build elements. So that's what I think.
Yeah, thank you. So Matt and Fiona, also, coming from the perspective of providing green spaces for children and spaces where children can interact with the built environment, what is your opinion on the sort of development of brownfield sites or de facto parks, essentially? Do you think construction on these sites is necessary? And what are your opinions overall on the need for mass scale development, as we saw earlier in the 20th century in Britain?
We're always going to advocate for more green spaces for young people, but we do think that there needs to be more nuance of looking at gender budgeting and who are using those spaces. So what proportion of the capital investment goes to different people, and not just to young people, to older residents as well, because we know that, and I'm sure everyone here is familiar with an amazing organisation called Make Space for Girls that's shown that many girls and young women don't feel safe using the spaces the outdoor spaces that are provided. But alongside that, we know the health benefits of being outside, of fresh air, of being in the elements, and also the confidence building that comes, as well as the health benefits of being able to play and exercise outside. I'm no expert, and Josh, it's really great to hear your perspective on this and on new builds. And it's making me think of, it was a few years back now, that I think Ollie Wainwright produced a sort of investigative documentary around a lot of new builds and how the portion of social, affordable and market rate housing was decided. And I could be misremembering this, but I seem to remember that there was something about developers inflating the costs of what it would cost to create that development, so that they could then get away with making the case that they couldn't afford to have social housing or such a high proportion of affordable housing. And I remember watching it at the time and thinking, why isn't this being shown in primary schools and secondary schools? Because children are some of the strongest advocates of what's just in life. And in fact, we find that that's another brilliant reason to work with young people and include them in these discussions, is that they can often say the unsayable, but the thing that maybe everyone is thinking in the room about, well, that's simply not fair. And trying to, if anyone here has children or nieces or nephews, trying to have an argument with a really forthright 8-year-old really actually pushes you into a corner. So I wonder if we need to have more primary school children who are having these discussions with government about some of our housing policies. So I think it's a difficult one because we need more housing. My sense is that it needs to be a combination of retrofit and new housing. And I wonder if one of the issues at play is long-termism, and anything that's bespoke rather than one size fits all requires that longer term approach, which I sense with our sort of political systems isn't always valued.
I think that's right, and I guess coming back to your question directly about the sort of the need to make a decision about the balance of retrofit versus new build. I mean, I think the thing that I would say is that we definitely should be retrofitting and using existing structures, existing buildings where we can, but we need to. It's not just a numbers game, so we need to really careful that we legislate for the function and the kind of quality outputs of that retrofitting. We saw what happened with the reduction in 2010 and then 2015 with the permitted development B1 retail offices to residential, and it's created absolute travesties in kind of living spaces, direct living spaces, and by no means is sort of strengthening our community. So I think there's a challenge there, and there's not a sort of one answer, but it's definitely not a numbers game of kind of how many units that we can get from the existing stock. We have to assess those situations, but the first situation in that assessment of the viability should be exactly as Fee says. It's got to be about looking at that long term. It's not the quick fix solution or the easy number game. And I think the only way we deal with that for some reason is we've got to have some degree of legislation within the planning kind of the sort of constitution of planning law that means that we, particularly if we're going to expect some of some of this housing to be delivered by the private sector. I mean, that said, I would advocate and push for so much more of affordable housing to be delivered through councils. And I think, again, like we said, I think our experience of peripherally, but interestingly, being asked in York to contribute. I mean, which is a city which is planning and now delivering in first stages of the largest kind of passive house kind of local authority social housing in Europe, I think now, and it's its largest number. We've been in conversation with, exactly as Fina said, some of those developments are on brownfield new sites, not on parks, but ex-industrial sites. And those it's really encouraging to see not only that they're really thinking from a community basis, obviously in terms of the environmental kind of credentials of the stock that they're doing there, that they're building there, or will be building very shortly, but really the communities that they're creating, the spaces in between, and seeing that definitely for the long term. I mean, we're engaging now with them and communities for, as Fee says, housing and the public open realm, with public realms within those schemes for 10, 15, 20 years down the line. And we need more of that sort of thinking. I know even with the urgency, these things are going to take time. So it's about making the decisions now, and also legislating to make sure in retrofit that we get quality homes for people.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Sorry, I've been having connection issues, so I do apologize for that. I was wondering if I could ask you more about your self-build projects and your kind of community projects, and ask if you think that self-build is, I guess, the way forward to solve our housing crisis. So yeah, if you tell us more about self-build and the way that you interact with children on that, and then I'll open the question to our other speakers as well.
I think self-build is important, not in the sense of we're not advocating that everybody's going to go on and build their own home, but we do think that it can be hugely empowering if you have those DIY skills to actually directly improve your built environment and not have to wait on someone else to do that for you. And arguably, we now live in a very, very serviced society where those kind of there are improvements, I suppose you could talk about, with right to repair. It's all very well to have a right to repair, but people need to also have the skills to be able to repair. More broad than the self-build itself, it is, I think, empowering children with the skills to understand the planning process. And I think most adults find that incredibly complex. But prior to Matt and Fiona, I had few years experience working within that community engagement realm, and it's really upsetting seeing how easy it is for developers to play with kind of smoke and mirrors when communities are not informed of what their rights are, and what a lot of the terminology means, what the language means, what the legislation means. And so if you don't speak that language and have that vocabulary, then that's really de-empowering and makes you really quite vulnerable to kind of wider movements that might be happening. So I think although self-build is something that it's really important, there are many communities that want to do self-build, and we really advocate for that. I think it's more widely around that the importance of understanding how the built environment comes to be, what are the different processes at play, and then on that smaller scale, having those practical skills to know how to improve your direct built environment.
I think Fee is spot on. I mean, I think there is always, not always, there probably will always be a relatively small percentage of people able or wanting to self-build. But again, in York, it's been really a pleasure to see kind of master planning where on two of the key kind of sites of sort of 5 big infrastructural sites for new housing, that there are areas within that give scope for community groups to raise the position to affordably finance self-build, and I guess create communities where with variety and personality and particularity to them, and also, I mean, as we've said, involving communities, young people, old people, in everyone in the conversation about what those spaces are, but at the right time and right from the get-go. I mean, I think that's one of the things that Fiona and I have been we've both had examples of that on different sides of the fence, where public consultation that's carried out by large house builders or developers is at best information sharing and at worst a smokescreen for ulterior motives. But when it's done genuinely, it has to be done right at the get-go and with the real agency, and that takes a bravery on the side of whoever's developing that housing.
Yeah, and Adam, I wonder if I can bring this conversation about community control onto you as well. So how might community control also be beneficial from an environmental perspective, kind of given your work on gentrification?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea, and it's something that I really believe in, this idea of the right to the city, which was developed in the 1960s, that people who live in the city should have the right to shape the city and to be shaped and transformed by the city, that a true democracy means that all people, all dwellers are able to advocate for themselves and to help decide how the city runs and who it's run for. And so I think the example that I gave on architects for social housing and the kind of cost analysis and plan that they created is a really beautiful way of demonstrating that, putting that democratic foundation to also creating solutions to address the housing shortage and housing crisis by building new homes and allowing people to contribute firsthand. And I think that there's also been interesting work done at Commonwealth think tank here in London, looking at models of instead of public-private partnerships, public commons partnerships, and to have the community as the other actor or the collaborator with the council in order to address the needs and changes that are in the community. And so I think one of those is the issue of air pollution or other toxic elements of the environment. And I think that working collaboratively as a community with the local council or the national government allows for solutions to be tailored to each situation, and in which the people who spend the most time there, who contribute most to the environment, can also contribute to how the environment is shaped in the best way possible. So I think there's a lot to be done, and I think there's a lot of interesting models that are being developed. Hopefully we can see them rolled out sometime soon. But yeah, I think that ordinary people and everyday people are able to create solutions that are grounded in the reality in which they live.
Yeah, thank you. And Josh, I wonder if I can bring you in on the potential for community control to potentially address the climate crisis and housing, but also just going with Adam, something that Adam just said. I know that you've been tweeting about some of the more positive work that councils have been doing, and I wonder if you know anything about how councils are beginning to incorporate tenants into their work, or some of those research at councils that you've been doing and maybe wanted to highlight. But yeah, before you do that, could I hear your thoughts on how community control might be able to help with the climate crisis in housing?
Yeah, I definitely think I would choose community control / involvement over the self-build route. I think, as Matt and Fiona have already said, there is an issue of the sort of information needed to be able to digest and to understand the complexities of the built environment. And of course, they could have a project manager who sort of runs with their perspective and their view. And if that is the case, then I would still say government legislation would need to push for greater sustainability, because obviously they have, just because it's a community doesn't mean they're going to automatically prioritize the environmental aspect of it. So that's why I would say community involvement is better. It's just a natural result of when you have a vested interest in your building and in your community that surrounds you, you're going to have better maintained buildings, and they're going to be performing better for the long term. I think how things unfold when areas need to densify, that could be a bit of a sore point for communities. So let's say you have a block which houses 50 families, and then the council earmarks that land to receive another 50. I think there could be some interesting conversations there, but I have seen some interesting work being done by Leather Market JMB. They're in Southwark, so they're not directly a branch of the council, but that's a community-run organisation which essentially looks after a portion of homes in North Southwark, well, the north part of Southwark, and they've done a really good job. They're working on an infill scheme right now called the Styles Estate Tower, and that by doing that, they're going to not only repair and retrofit an existing building, but they're also going to add in new homes and welcome new members into their organisation. So that's addressing the first part of your question. In terms of what Adam was just saying, I think I'm almost tempted to give councils a bit of a rope here and say, I can understand where they're coming from. Oftentimes, as I said at the beginning, there is a big financial pressure on them. So both Labour and Conservative councils have sometimes skewed their financial modelling towards bringing in more expensive flats, for want of a better word, and then that in turn, brings this knock-on effect of gentrification. So there is a need to renew communities and bring in better facilities and make improvements. That's a need, but through what and then Adam sort of you did rightfully mention collaboration. If we have renewal alongside collaboration, it's going to end well. But if it's only the council making decisions, that's when it does tend to go perhaps too far, and that's when you have people either pushed out physically and literally through being relocated, or through affordability means when they can't afford to remain in that area anymore. So I think there is a challenge for councils in terms of where do they find the money to pay for the new builds or to pay for even the retrofit works. I think I saw a really good project done in Camden by Henley Hallibrown Architects. That one was it was a retrofit scheme of an existing building, but also alongside some infill. So it can be done where you're bringing in funds from the new build elements, where you may bring in a new type of community, but it does need sensitivity. It does need the community to feel empowered and engaged. And again, coming back on what Matt and Fiona said earlier about, is it just a tokenistic and a sort of lip service to engagement, or is it actually meaningful? Can the community really make a difference through what they have to say? Just one final point I'll add. Sorry, I know I've been speaking. In Custom House, I did a bit of a research project that was back in 2020 into the work of Peach, and when I spoke to them, a lot of them were saying they came to the means as part of a community advisory panel, and they got the perception that the decisions were already made before they got there. And in actual fact, if you look back to the master plans that were done 5 years prior, the things that came out of those panel discussions were exactly what had already been previously forecasted in the master plans. And I can imagine how disheartening that was I don't imagine that Peach were really rifling through those master plans, but they wouldn't have had to really get the sense, as I say, that this is pretty much a done deal. We want to build these towers in your area. Do you want a park here? Yeah, that'll do. And so this is what we need to get beyond. And I really like the complexity that Fiona brought in terms of gender budgeting and age budgeting. That really is the types of sensitive long-term approach that we need.
Thank you. And I wonder if Adam, do you have a response to that? Do you think councils are doing lip service, or do you think that moves to incorporate greater community building or consensus are genuine from your research? Do you have a response to what Josh was saying?
Well, I think that Josh is correct in the analysis of councils are strapped for money, and this ties back to austerity policy that as the national government has restricted funds to local councils are now desperate for new revenue in order to keep up. The issue is that they're selling their only asset, with no hope for the future, and that's just being transferred into the hands of private corporations and the wealthy, right? So I do think that I do think that the council does play a role and a really crucial role in the gentrification of neighborhoods, because they are financially incentivized to do so, and it's almost necessary in their current role or in their current constellation to gentrify people out, because they'll always, as the economy must continue to grow and grow, that they must enhance always the amount of money coming in through council taxes or whatever. Well, as people are on stagnant wages and people are living in more desperate poverty, those people aren't going to be able to contribute more council tax. So I think that the council is put in a position that really disenfranchises people. And I think that, it's hard to find examples in which I really believe that there are councils that are championing the working class. I think some of the development or the work of grassroots movements to push for higher or to meet the thresholds that the city holds for affordable housing are really necessary. And I've seen some welcome changes after many, many years of pressure and many years of campaigning and organizing, that there has been changes and that change is possible. But I'd be interested in seeing a redeveloped model for how councils develop. And I think that groups like the Southwark Planning Network, providing consultation onto the new Southwark Plan, rolling out things like social impact assessments. These are all things that councils can do in order to create development that meets the needs of the community that's there.
Yeah, thank you. Josh, I can see that you have your hand raised, but I'm just going to ask a question so that we can widen the discussion as well, and then hopefully come to your point within that. My final question from me, so for our audience at home, this is a prime opportunity to ask your own questions before I wrap things up. My final question is, what are the next steps for building green social housing, or what would you like to see a campaign or a grassroots movement looking like? So I know that Untitled Britain have been trying to drum up attention for the hope that all council housing can be insulated by the year 2030, as opposed to the cycle of demolition and construction that we're currently witnessing. So for all of our panelists currently, what do you think are the next steps for building or preserving green social housing, and how would you imagine that a movement would look, or a sort of concerted and sincere effort to create this safe future would look like? If I can start with Matt and Fiona.
I'm going to answer that question sort of hopefully directly, but we've been involved in one project which was a really successful recipient through GLA Space Hive funding, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Space Hive kind of model of funding. It's an initiative which provides beyond match funding for community grassroots projects based on the amount of grassroots interest in an idea. A project gets put forward by a community, and there's a platform, a digital platform by which members of the community can share ideas and their support for that. And it doesn't have to be in monetary terms. They're much more interested in the numbers of people interested, and funding is allocated for those projects which can initiate kind of real change. Ours was a project that we were successful, which was in collaboration with the Cooperative Foundation to engage with a group of with Brixton House Theatre, to engage with young people in the borough as the theatre moved from one space of London to another. But I see now, and we're interested in the fact that Camden has just announced its Space Hive funding for re-engaging and reimagining its high streets. I see that it could be a really useful tool that could be, and each tested at the scale it's now, we're talking of hundreds of thousands of pounds, not huge sums for each project, but it could be something that slowly grew and amplified, which my experience has been that it's really engaged interest, not just in the people that are seeding the ideas in those communities, but by gaining broader collaborative kind of support for an idea. And I think that's, for us, that's what's developed in our organization. It's giving people agency, and as soon as you give people agency in the future of their communities, then they become convicted and convinced in ongoing if like maintenance of that idea and pushing things forward. And it seems to be at least from our perspective, a really positive collaborative way of sort of starting to initiate that funding. And that could be initially in the public realm of those new communities, but I don't see why it can't be extended further, because also it keeps the community, but it really keeps an engagement from the funding side of that. In this case, it could be the local authority, Camden, it could be the GLA in terms of the Space Hive project we did in Brixton, but it could be, a local authority in terms of a portion of its kind of, new housing development. And it seems to be a really exciting model that encourages the things that Adam and Josh are both talking to, which is I guess a collaborative kind of approach between the community and the local authority that's genuine.
And I'd just add to that, curriculum changes and long-termism. So these are fundamental life skills that are not being taught in schools, and that is perpetuating this inequality. So it would be amazing to see aspects of the built environment and architecture on the curriculum for all young people.
Thank you so much. Josh, can I come to you? So what would you say are the next steps for building or preserving our green social housing? And what would you see a campaign for that looking like?
Unfortunately, the campaign for green social housing is going to be quite complex. I know I've heard that if you want to have a winning campaign, you need to have a singular message, but unfortunately, there's just so much that we have to do. I will try and give two, as brief as I can. I think the first one would be, just to clarify earlier, when I said we need to build more, I do genuinely believe we do, it's a retrofit first, from a retrofit first standpoint. And even before we retrofit, I think we need to understand where we are now. We should be making efforts to begin harvesting data about what it's actually like in terms of occupancy. And I don't mean qualitative data in terms of, it's a nice place to live. I think we need to be really understanding temperature changes, moisture, all these really granular details so that we can then feed that into building information models. A lot of the time, councils make the argument that it's uneconomical to retrofit, but I would respond to that uneconomical in comparison to what? Do you know how much it would cost? Have we modeled that data? So I think that's where we need to really start. And then moving on from there, I think materials research is critical. Just getting to level one would be insulating everything and making homes as airtight and as near to passive house standards as we can. But then level two would be, can we use materials which are actually healthy for our system? So I'm thinking about things like better lime renders and things like wood fiber insulation. So these are no longer, sort of pilfering from our environment and causing damage. They're improving our environment. They are, sustainable and renewable, and they're also better for our bodies. So I think we need more government funding for materials research. And then just to finish off, I think definitely data. Once we build these new homes or once we retrofit, it's really critical that we're measuring and monitoring how things are going, because then we can see what actually works and we can continually tweak. A lot of the time, buildings are given BREEAM awards and LEED certificates based on lab experiments and the way that it would have performed in safe or sterile conditions. But the reality is the world is not a lab. So we need to really understand how these components are performing and then use that going forward. I thought it was interesting, Matt mentioned about the Space Hive model and the finance systems that are at play. And earlier Adam mentioned that he sees the public office or the councils retrenching and they're no longer participating as much as they should or could. I think that's only going to continue. I can really not see us going back to how it used to be, but I think almost we could open our arms to it and welcome it, welcome private finance getting involved. I think I read an interesting work from Jeremy Rifkin where he talks about how if private finance, whether that's insurers or investors or how we want to frame it, if they actually got involved in an economy of abundance and expansion rather than consuming everything that we have at hand, they could make money and we have a better society. So, I mean, that's something I'd like to explore more, definitely.
Thank you so much. Adam, I will come to you finally. What do you see a campaign for green social housing looking like? What do you think are our next steps?
Yeah, I guess to reiterate my earlier point, I think that a social housing movement that confronts climate change and confronts the reality is one that is global, is one that confronts the legacy of empire that underfunded the global south and has caused people to be unprepared and unequipped to deal with the consequences of development for the few. So I would really love to see, housing as a form of reparation, housing that, puts working class communities and people of color at the center, because those are the first people who are going to be impacted. These are the people who are already being impacted by the climate crisis. And so I think, building homes that are homes with dignity for people to live with dignity, homes for people who live here, not people who spend 2 weeks of the summer here and fly out to wherever they are, homes not for investors, homes for people who live here. I feel hopeful, and I feel like discussions like this and having people coordinate and hear from one another only betters us and makes us better prepared to actually confront the reality of a changing climate.
Yeah, I feel like that's such a sort of galvanizing note to end on, the idea, that maybe in so having these conversations about the potential for green social housing is in itself a form of praxis or a form of awareness raising for like our potential to create a just future for all people. So I'd like to, I guess, finally just open the floor to any further questions or any final statements or thoughts that our speakers might have before I kind of close off. I can see there's a question about, Adam, whether or not you've studied gentrification around Brixton. So with the 21-story tower that's being planned in Brixton Village, have you studied that?
I did study Brixton while I was undertaking the quantitative analysis. And I have, supported the campaign, the Save Noor campaign from 2020, and that's kind of morphed into the Stop Hondo Tower campaign. I think it's interesting that that these kinds of issues, and for people who have been involved with anti-gentrification movements, I think a lot of us were really surprised at the resounding support that, the Save Noor campaign received. For those who don't know, this was a small Iraqi-owned shop in Brixton Village that provided, cuisine for, the local community. And I think that it's not a surprise that this happened during COVID. When our local environment has been brought into hyper focus and we actually realize what's around us and who's around us. And I think it also came at the height of Black Lives Matter, and that we understand that the process of gentrification is highly racialized, as I found in my research, specifically in London, but in I would argue every global city. That it's a highly racialized process. So I think there's, a very welcome surge of support for making sure that the great needs that exist in Brixton are actually being met. And I don't think that comes in the form of a 21-story office building at a time when most of us are, not working in offices anymore. So yeah, I'm interested to see, and I support the campaign and send my solidarity to people engaged in that struggle.
Well, thank you for that. So I'd like to now finally just open the floor to any final thoughts from our panelists, if you have them. Yeah.
I just wanted to share that I am also genuinely optimistic about the path ahead. It was interesting. I mean, Adam's probably deeper into the cross-London research in terms of what the boroughs are doing in terms of affordable housing provision. I definitely think there could be more. How they're going to strategize to do that, I'd be interested to know more from them. But I think it's interesting that the recently closed or about to close Brick by Brick, in part of their research, they were saying that they actually they were capping the amount of affordable housing provision to 50% or less, because they felt that any affordable housing they did build would be almost immediately snapped up by right to buy. So I think there is also an interesting issue there at play. And there are also a lot of schemes which show that it can be done. So for example, there's Hillingdon Square in Norfolk by May, where that totally pushes back against this notion that social housing, when it's fallen into disrepair, it can't be helped. When they looked at it, they found that the structure was absolutely sound. So they took it back to that core structure, which is concrete, and there's such a high level of embodied energy there that there's no point reducing that to rubble and starting from scratch. So and that's what they did. So they kept that structure in place. And then there's also the Waterstraat complex. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, in Belgium, by Bob 361. That one used recycled material to build, and it also was near passive house in terms of its energy performance. So there are case studies which show that social housing can be green and can be paid for, actually, if councils start thinking strategically.
Yeah, thank you. Malvina, do you have any closing remarks?
Well, I think just with Josh's optimism, I want to finish with from my point of view, from a word of optimism. I think we're constantly delighted and surprised with the people that we work with, the young people we work with, that they actually are optimistic, but they're also engaged and are passionate about making their world that they will be growing into better. And actually, they're a sort of generation who have see things incredibly radically, incredibly differently, but also really pragmatically. And I think it's that sort of that optimism and pragmatism that we confront every day with the young people we're working with, that gives me real hope. I see it in my own kids, that I see the real hope that there is change there, and it just needs actually small amounts of support and money in reality to give agency to those people to have a real impact on their built environments. So I think, as Fee said earlier, I mean, I would advocate for, and we are advocating for, better understanding in schools of the built environment, because that empowerment is the thing that's going to change and shift in the changes that we need in the long term.
Thank you so much. So I'd just like to thank our speakers so much for joining us, and also thank you to everyone who is watching and participating from home. Thank you for your questions. If you'd like to continue this conversation, I believe everyone's Twitter links are in the chat, so feel free to contribute again further beyond this conversation and into your own personal lives. If you'd like to hear more from It's Freezing in LA, their 8th issue is coming out very imminently, and that is on the relationship between climate and our ongoing border crises. I'm now gonna close. I'm gonna log off. So finally, thank you so much to everyone for joining, and I look forward to thinking about this more and with Josh's optimism in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.